For today's episode, we're going down to Knoxville, Tennessee. I serve on the Global Supply Chain Institute Advisory Board at the University of Tennessee. And it is a thrill for me to kick off this episode by introducing UTK Professor Marianne Wanamaker, who is the Executive Director of the Howard Baker Center for Public Policy and an Associate Professor of Economics. We're diving into labor economics and how people working in our supply chains are navigating through economic constraints and increasing automation and AI. Marianne and I are going to zoom in on labor in the American market, and then later I'll bring on 0100 Head of Research Science, Colin Gilbert, to zoom out to key takeaways for supply chain leaders around the globe. Welcome, Marianne. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Let me just go ahead and ask you a little bit about yourself.
Great. So I am an economist by training, and in some ways I think I was born to be an economist. I knew growing up that I loved math. Didn't know what I would do with that. Got to college, told everybody I was going to major in math. I found my way into the economics profession that I love with all of my heart, almost as much as I love my own kids. I've been at UT my entire career. Came here in 2009. I've been connected with the supply chain folks at UT that entire time. And then in 2017, I left UT for a year, went to work in the White House as the chief labor economist, and realized that public policy matters a lot for business success, for the ways that supply chains are operating, and whether they are successful all depends on government policy. And I believe the role of government is government is here to make individuals and companies successful. That's their job. I think it's important to ground students who are interested in public service in the realities of business and what it is that business cares about, how it is that government can help them be more successful.
That's great, and it's going to be something I want to circle back to, the policy component. But let me pull back to the simplest overall question. What are the major forces impacting the labor market today as you think about folks who are worried about hiring and maybe thinking about their manufacturing footprints?
The biggest challenge in the labor market right now, as it has been for the last several years, is labor supply. Not enough workers to meet the demand that employers feel for their goods and services. There are two components to that crisis. One is labor force participation, which we've had a labor force participation problem since the participation rate started to decline, which was in the late 90s. The other piece, the more recent piece, and the part that I think still hasn't been fully recognized, although I'm starting to see better signs about it, is population growth. So you get a workforce because the population grows, and because the population that you have, a certain share of it is working. So it's population plus labor force participation rate gives you the workforce in front of you. And the population growth rate is also now a bit of a crisis. So we went from, on average, 1% or so growth in population in this country every single year to numbers that now round to zero. So something like 0.3, 0.4%. It's just really hard to meet the needs of America's businesses, where the economy is growing at 2 and 2.5%, sometimes 3%, with a labor force that has an underlying population growth of less than 0.5%. Those things don't add up, and that's resulting in the labor supply crisis that you're experiencing.
How do I think about designing my work in an environment where I may not have much replacement growth in terms of birth rates for domestic workers, but I may have an immigration opportunity? How do I think about that as an employer?
I think some of the more interesting conversations that I've had in the last few years have been with entrepreneurs who have figured out how to use the immigration system to their advantage to staff their businesses. Now, that is easier in some industries than it is in others. Trucking, famously, is not one of them. Warehousing, not one of them. Agriculture, farming, hospitality all have their own lane in the immigration system. Employers in those industries are far more likely to benefit from those programs and to figure out a way to help to staff their organizations. So some of these immigration categories are going to be tied to employers.
What are the other approaches to tackling labor shortages? I'm curious how you think about automation as a labor economist.
So first, I think we've really turned a corner in terms of our public narrative about automation in the last 3 years. So as late as 2019, people were still reading books like The Rise of the Robots that was all about how robots were going to take their jobs. And it was this fear-based narrative around automation that I really think we are over. We have ChatGPT as this superhuman thing, but more importantly, we need automation to help us resolve our population challenge. Think about economic growth, the rate of growth of the output of this country. I think we all acknowledge a good GDP growth number is between 2 and 3%. Let's call it 2.5%. If you want your economy to grow by 2.5% and you don't have a workforce that is growing by 2.5%, then your workforce has got to get more productive by the tune of whatever the difference is between the growth in the workforce, the people, and 2.5%. So if your population is growing by 0.5%, and that's how fast your workforce is growing, then you need 2% productivity increase every single year. Every worker needs to be 2% more productive than they were the year before to reach your GDP growth target. You're not going to get there by changing things within the workforce or within the workplaces other than automating, adding robots, right? That is how a worker gets more productive and gets us to this GDP target. It's going to save us from what otherwise would be abysmal economic growth numbers. The other thing that I think the pandemic did, made it really clear to employers who were contemplating automation investments that those investments are more likely to pay off than they thought they were in 2019.
I can see how that not only changes the equation freestanding, it also changes the equation potentially on the rate of improvement in any one of these automation technologies, because the more money coming in, the more certainty of the market that's buying your technology. Do unions have a rational case for resisting automation, or do unions just not get it?
Well, I think to the extent that organized labor contracts over the adoption of technology, right, I think that tells you that at least in those particular contract situations, they view automation as a substitute, not a complement. A lot of evidence that the most likely skill set to be replaced by automation is a blue-collar skill set, so to speak. So lower levels of formal education, a more mechanical skill set, right? So more about using your hands. That's the sort of thing that automation has been better at replacing. Now, I do think that our current ChatGPT moment is making all of us reevaluate that assumption, because what ChatGPT is really good at is not moving cargo, right, but writing things that I, in particular, get paid to write. We're maybe shifting our perspective on this a little bit, but I think by and large, we still appreciate automation as largely addressing a labor supply problem, in particular in blue-collar work. Now, I'll also say, though, that is where our greatest labor supply challenges is in, are we getting the skilled trades? Can we get people in places to do jobs that are earning kind of at minimum wage, $15, $20 an hour? So that's in the retail fast food kind of world where we've replaced a lot of those individuals and those jobs. Is that taking somebody's job? Sort of, but in some ways that's taking a vacant job, right? Because those are jobs that are really hard to fill. So I think it's pretty complicated.
What are the actions you can take as an employer to equip your people at any level, entry level, blue collar, mid-career, you name it, to be better at dealing with this tech?
I think it's like anything else. If you haven't built a culture where people understand that learning something new is good for you and good for them, right? And then you say all of a sudden, like, I know I haven't asked you to learn a new skill in 20 years, but here's a tech thing I need you to learn. That is not going to work. The companies and the organizations that are going to do this best are ones where people kind of have already bought into this mindset of, I'm asking you to make an investment that's painful, because learning new things is painful for a lot of folks. I'm asking you to make an investment that is going to make you better at your job for me, and I have some way of compensating you for that, right? And so we're both better off.
I had such a great chat with Marianne that we ran out of time on our first recording session. She and I were eager to have a longer conversation, so we brought her back for a second time. In our last conversation, we're talking a bit about education and shaping the future of the workforce. What role do you see for higher education, and in particular for those who have more vocational routes to a long-term career, and things we can do to facilitate people learning the skills that they're going to need going forward?
So if you think about a traditional 4-year degree, We typically think about that degree as providing you a set of generalized skills that allow you to pursue multiple job paths. So we're not training you necessarily for a specific occupation, although there are examples of that, and you're set up for whatever shifts may happen in the labor market over time. That model is under pressure for a number of reasons. One is that the pace of change in the labor market is quick. So the skills that you learn when you're 22 aren't necessarily going to be relevant when you're 52. And so you're going to need some skill updating along the way. But another reason it's under pressure is that we have really leaned into this narrative that college is expensive. It's too expensive. It doesn't pay off. That you go get a 4-year degree, you're going to have $200,000 worth of debt, and you're going to earn $30,000 a year. And that is just simply not the case. In the state of Tennessee, for example, your first 2 years of college are free if you choose to take advantage of that program. And at least at the University of Tennessee, half of students graduate with no debt at all. So there are ways that you can build up $200,000 in undergraduate fees and tuition, but it's not at a public institution in places like Tennessee. So we've really kind of lost the truth about higher ed and the return that it gives. And because we've seen such high returns in the labor market in the last few years, we've also seen kids who come out of high school get really tempted by the $15, $18, $20 an hour job and choose that over an immediate enrollment in higher ed, either 2-year or 4-year. You've also asked a question about kind of the non-4-year path. So what does it look like to do a 2-year degree or to go to trade school? People, by the way, are not real clear about what trade school is. It takes a lot of different forms, or I think about trade school as, okay, I didn't get an associate's degree necessarily, but I do have some post-high school training that allows me to enter a trade. And in Tennessee, you do that through a particular set of higher ed institutions. Those institutions, although we talk a lot about sending kids to trade school, those institutions are not seeing a surge in enrollment that would correspond to the decline in enrollment in 4-year institutions. So we've built this narrative that 4-year schools are too expensive, that it doesn't pay off, everybody should go to trade school, and now we're getting the worst of both worlds, which is people aren't going to 4-year institutions, but they're also not going to trade school. They're going to work. They're going to get a job right out of school. And it's tempting because of those higher labor market returns. But in the long run, what we know is that those short-term gains don't lead to careers that could sustain families. So yes, you're going to earn $18 or $20 coming out right out of high school, but you're earning the same $18 or $20 10 years from now. And education is the tool that allows you to earn more as you age.
Do you see much of an opportunity or a trend at all for those who come out of high school, go ahead and start working $18-20 an hour, and then think, wait a sec, I want to go back, either for an associate's or for some partial or for some certification type training, of which there's many different flavors. Does that happen? And is that one of the ways out of this conundrum?
It could be. The problem is that people tend not to do that. So what happens is that if you don't enroll in college, and that can be, I'm in college here, I'm including trade school. If you don't enroll in some sort of postgraduate education right after you leave high school, the probability that you will do so declines precipitously after that. So there's a momentum effect here that we're not currently taking advantage of, and we're losing. I think that the fear among education economists is we're losing a generation of students to really high COVID era, right out of high school wages, and they're never going back to higher ed.
Before even my day, there weren't that many choices. You worked here or here. If you lived in this particular place, then you could either go to college or go straight to work. And it feels like things have shifted so much that there's so many different choices. Are people feeling differently about their choices versus the choices themselves really being different in the labor market?
You were far more likely to move for a job 30 or 40 years ago than you are now. So in some ways, our choices are narrower than they were before. Really, for the last 40 years, we've seen a pretty steady decline in people's willingness to pick up, move to another city in pursuit of job opportunities.
It does say something about the way we've evolved, I guess, in the United States, at least as a society.
There were days in March and April 2020, where we were pulling information that we had from Tennessee state data and sending it to the White House, they could turn around and tell the president, like, okay, this is what we really think is happening. And we're informing this with data on the ground from unemployment insurance in Tennessee.
What data do we wish we had at the federal level? And how valuable is it to have continuous data sets, even if we know they're not fantastic?
There is this tension between, do I change this data series into the thing I want? Or do I recognize that we've been running this data series for 50 years as it is? And if I change it, I lose the benefit of comparison because now I don't know whether the change is because I changed the calculation or if it's a real change, right? So what you tend to see is parallel data sets, right? This is not the right way to calculate CPI anymore, but we don't want to throw away the old series, so we're just going to have two series. I wish we had that we don't have is related to workforce. No surprise there. There are actually two pieces. One is that we don't understand how people are getting educated on the job. No data. So we don't measure training. We don't measure kind of in-house certifications or whatever badges, whatever it is that your company is doing to get you up to speed and ready to take on the next role. We just don't have any idea if it's happening. The other piece I wish we had is that we don't understand anything really about people who are out of the labor force, what skills they have, where they have worked in the past, and what it would take to get them back in the labor force. So we can't target any kind of program to those who aren't working because we don't understand their characteristics and we're not asking. There's actually a lot of data that we already have about people that we're not using effectively because we've restricted the ways that we allow the federal government to use data that it collects and the state as well.
What do you think is going on with the tech layoffs? Do you have a sense of whether it's a good thing, a bounce back opportunity, or a bad thing, a lost momentum opportunity?
So let's suppose that the people who are getting laid off in tech are all software engineers. Am I worried about that? Not at all, right? Software engineers are not going to end up on the sidelines. There are just too many opportunities. Their skills are so transferable and so in demand. If, on the other hand, the headcount that they're laying off is janitorial staff or something like that, now I'm concerned. Okay, because now I'm less certain that the economy is going to absorb those who lost their jobs. If you go back and think about what happened in the dot-com bubble, which seems like eons ago and kind of was, but in the dot-com bubble burst, that wasn't a big deal in the labor force sense because most of the folks who lost their jobs had higher skill levels. They have advanced degrees, and so you lose your job in tech in 2001, and you're going to find a job by 2002. So the tech job losses, I expect, look more like 2001 than they do 2008, 2009.
You certainly learned how to be a great storyteller. Really appreciate you taking the time to come back and chat with us for a few more minutes, Marianne. So great to see you again.
Anytime, Kevin. Thank you.
Marianne's insights were exactly what I wanted to hear to better understand the economic forces at play as we look at the supply chain workforce. For our last segment, I'm bringing in Colin Gilbert, 0100's head of research science, to help me synthesize my conversation with Marianne into takeaways that supply chain leaders can apply today. Colin Gilbert, who heads our research science group here at 0100. Colin, welcome to the show. Looking forward to having your perspective on some of these questions.
Hey, Kevin, how you doing? Back on the pod, Radical Reinvention. Good to be here.
It's always a pleasure, Colin. Always a pleasure.
Always. Well, we see each other every day, so I'm not sure how much of a pleasure it is, but it's at least becoming a habit at this point. I was listening this week, though, to your conversation with Marianne, and it was a really interesting dialogue around a lot of what you've been writing about with regards to Skills 2030 and digital talent and the future of work. So I was curious as I was listening to it, what were the top three themes in your mind that we can discuss today?
And there are a lot of things that Marianne covered and that impact supply chain leaders, business leaders, economists. But the three in order, let's say, of the degree to which you have least control up to which you have the most control for our audience, supply chain folks, are number one, labor supply. She talked a lot about where it is, how it's changing, what are the fundamental drivers. It's worth understanding, certainly from a policy standpoint, and I'm sure you have some perspectives on that, but it's hard to control. Second is automation. there is some control there. Here at 0100, our members are doing quite a bit of innovation in that domain. But then last is reskilling. How do you take what you have and equip yourself to make that team a team of tomorrow, not just a team of today? So those three really stand out. And I think the talent lever is the one where, from a transformation standpoint, we see our members putting quite a bit of energy. So let's talk about, from a data standpoint, which is where I always end up showing up at your doorstep and looking for some facts. I'm curious about the labor force participation thing. Can you give me some data with where we are historically, what seemed to be the recoveries, let's say, after COVID, and where that leaves people trying to plan around existing labor force?
Just to be very precise, the labor force participation right now in the United States is 62.6%. But that number really doesn't mean anything without context. You have to remember that that number is just reporting the eligible population looking for work and not people who have voluntarily exited the labor force. And so the number has a lot of movement over time. Looking at the latest release from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, as of March, we've actually recovered 4 in 5 workers shed during COVID, if you use that indicator.
Still, though, it's below peak, is my understanding. And I think labor force participation was peaking perhaps in the 90s.
The peak was circa 2000, and it was up 5% or close to 67, 68% at its peak. But in the wider historical record, and the BLS stats go back decades, obviously, we're talking about, a range of less than 10 percentile points, rose from around 58, 59%, in the post-war period, up to that peak of 68%, and then has been on this slow, steady decline. So Marianne talked about the bonus labor pool and how it's already like a missing indicator of how things looked like they were flattening out after the Great Recession and even during parts of COVID, because people delayed retirement for any number of reasons. Conversely, the Fed is publishing more and more about is the fact that the prime age working population is becoming increasingly volatile. It's not mysterious when people face a sudden scarcity of workers year in and year out, because it's those two competing trend lines is where the bonus pool is sitting with regards to their future expectation for retirement, and where the prime age population is with regards to their outside work commitments.
So these shifts, the bonus pool is a great concept. I think some of this volatility in work supply, it's a bit of a silver lining to the cloud of COVID in some respects. It changed the way we think about work. So I guess I'm interested in what we see organizations doing to take advantage of some of that.
Two things, jump to mind off the top of my head. One is the organizations that are really proactive about defining what are usually referred to as business resource groups or BRGs, that basically look at different segments of their employee base. And if you use those proactively to try to get ahead of trends, to get ahead of the writing on the wall, you can really establish a first mover advantage to navigate some of these changing trends. Our friends over at Grainger recognized that during COVID, there was a gender bias in terms of who was staying or exiting the workforce. And to get ahead of getting women back in the workforce or providing them with more flexible accommodations, including a partnership with an innovative project called Mom's Project, I think is based out of Chicago, is a digital recruitment platform catering specifically to this niche group, which is incredibly important if you want to return stability and gender balance to your employee work base. Grainger has been on the Fortune Best Company to Work For list for the last 2 years, specifically recognized as one of the best places for women to work, and the only representative on a list of 100 companies that hails from the industrial services sector. I think the second one that is just top of mind, because we've been doing a lot of benchmarking on career portals and how people are catering to attraction of scarce talent right now, is looking at how the majority of firms do or do not handle remote work. Everybody that we've looked at in a sample of 100 B2C brands is still hiring for remote or work from home positions right now to varying degrees. But it's interesting that we found that less than 10% of those 100 brands allow you to filter for jobs that have a remote work qualification in the job spec from the career portal. One of those 100 companies that's in the strict minority is Unilever, who's actually made it one of the 5 filtering criteria. So if you're one of these groups in the bonus pool or the prime age working group that's trying to look to extend your participation in the workforce or get back into the workforce with more flexibility, they are actively catering to that demo much better and much more effectively than the vast majority of supply chain organizations.
I'm intrigued about how automation fits into large-scale thinking about work. What are your thoughts about labor supply and whether automation is going to put you out of a job or actually make your job better?
So, Kevin, I agree about what Marianne said regarding the fear-based narrative. In other words, automation evokes the recurring specter of labor redundancy and job loss, but that's a reflexive narrative based on past precedent. So if you recall, 0100 ran its own survey of 1,000 plus supply chain leaders, and I felt validated when we asked the following question. Specifically, when you think about scaling manufacturing automation across the business, how important are each of the following 6 factors? 1, people; 2, materials; 3, regulation; 4, customer engagement; 5, data; and 6, partners. What was interesting about the results was that 73% of respondents rated the first category, people, as either a 4 or a 5, critically important. And that proportion significantly outpaced any and all of the competing other answer categories.
Yeah, I remember that survey, Colin, and I was expecting people to come out high, but I think it came out even higher than I was counting on. Automation and the redesign of work, especially when you start including artificial intelligence as a capability that automates purely logical work, in addition to the kind of automation we know from a mechanical standpoint, it is going to absolutely change what is possible for the machine versus the human to do. But I wonder what it says about how to build exciting careers for people in a context like that.
The one thing that you got to do first is we need to separate the conversation about physical automation, i.e. robots, versus digital automation, i.e. AI and ML. From McKinsey and the World Economic Forum, the McKinsey study says that 25% of capital spend over the next 25 years is going to be going to robotics and automation. And leadership is likely to implement automation in 11 of 15 categories of industrial use categories. So it's just automation is coming for you, and it looks like an overwhelming tidal wave. But if you switch to the World Economic Forum data, what that introduces is people are really uncertain about where that is going to net out in terms of what machines do and what humans do. And it gets more nuanced when you divide physical and digital. But if you kind of aggregate everything, people say that about a third of all business-related tasks are automated as of today. And if you push it out 5 years, they're confident that over 40% of activities are going to be automated by 2027%. And it's actually down from how optimistic they were about how quickly this transition was going to happen. And what's really happening is people are figuring out it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
I remember this fantastic book called Men and Machines by Stuart Chase, published right before the stock market crash in 1929. At the same time in history, when we were blown away by what industry could do, and automation was displacing workers. But it didn't exactly destroy the economy. The economy went through its transition, painful at that particular time, but came out with far more new jobs and new sort of requirements for human creativity. So I guess what I feel like is there is a need for industry by industry to think about what this automation unlocks in terms of the opportunity to take what's special about humans, creativity, intimacy, just physicality, What do we do differently? You mentioned how industry by industry it's different. What do you think is going on in consumer goods?
I think consumer goods is always a good test case because it's one of the bigger segments in terms of competing industry. It employs north of 170 million employees globally. And when you look at how World Economic Forum breaks it down, the consumer goods is representative of the overall trends. Those three factors are, what percentage of your workers have quote unquote skill stability, meaning that they don't need immediate upskilling and retraining in the foreseeable future of a time horizon of the next 5 years. So 60% of workers have skill stability in consumer goods. So the remainder need to be upskilled and reskilled, and that can vary from a month to 6 months to over a year, depending on which jobs they're moving into. The best estimate is that the industry is still going to experience about 20% churn over the next 5 years, which is not necessarily people exiting the industry or the organization, but it means they're moving between jobs. And what amount of people do stay versus seek out other opportunities is hugely uncertain. It will have an accentuating effect on that labor supply problem. Because if 20% of the people say, no, this isn't for me, a worst case scenario, then the labor force participation rate specific to your industry takes another really significant nosedive, which creates, a cycle of being more and more reliant on automation at a faster and faster rate.
So what this does is it ups the ante on reskilling. From Marianne's points, reskilling is the one you can control. Reskilling gives you a chance to kind of play the variability in these numbers to your advantage. Can you talk about a few that strike you as leading reskilling initiatives?
As you said, this is absolutely what people have the most control over. And as a result, I think our most popular or trending inbound questions from customers in the community is, give me examples of who's figured this out. Some of those big tent initiatives that we're looking at it more holistically, the ones that come to mind were AT&T had this Future Ready program that recognized that their entire business was moving from copper to the cloud and from landlines to wireless and 5G, and just one of the greatest pivots in tech and telecommunications at large. Similarly, Amazon had their Upskilling 2025 programs of just being on the vanguard of automating any number of logistics, warehousing, delivery, cloud-enabled functions. And then all the consultancies and auditing houses like PwC had their New World New Skills program, which they were actually trying to pilot something internally to sell to others that were really in need, that were focusing more on digital tools and technology. But again, I think that we really have to get more specific about industry examples.
One, for instance, that's a matter of public record is Volkswagen. In fact, all the auto guys really are adapting to a vocational model for the new EV platforms, because that really requires reskilling both novice and experienced workers alike. I think auto is chronically underestimated in the world supply chain for its maturity, its brilliance, its leading edge thinking. Auto has got a huge and very experienced and established workforce all around the world. And they've been through this adaptation process that goes all the way back to the early 20th century when Henry Ford gave us the modern supply chain in some respects. But what I think is exciting is they understand the value of vocational training. They engage with the technology, the equipment, the machinery, and the materials, and try to give people a chance to build a career that's exciting and diverse and interesting. I think Volkswagen is a great example of somebody who really understands that the future is about a completely new type of platform. And what we know from the history of scaling automotive is it's going to have to be integrated in a way that virtually no other large-scale industrial supply chains are. And that requires people. So I love the way that some of the best in auto, and this applies to Tier 1 too, by the way, Lear, Johnson Controls, people like that, incredibly advanced at thinking about how to put that sort of vocational training into the relationship with their workforce as they redesign and redeploy automation and technology in the shifting shape of their industry, EV being the unbelievable overhaul of a lifetime.
No, I think that's really good insight. And this is part and parcel of our benchmarking work at 0100 is that if you ask these really important questions about who is doing what to anticipate and counteract this shared problem, this shared dilemma, you can't just look at your immediate peer set. You can't look at your left and your right. And if you benchmark off one another, you probably won't move very far, very fast. And so you have to take a cross-industry perspective and say, what are people doing that are at a fundamentally different stage of maturity that I can learn and make a great leap forward based on what I'm doing and what my immediate peer set is doing right now. I just think that is critical to address this fear, uncertainty, and doubt that really comes to the topics that we were talking about today.
Yep, it's a great observation.
So Kevin, going back where we started, you said that the outstanding questions were threefold. 1, labor supply, 2, automation, and 3, reskilling. What are the immediate answers to those open themes or questions that we can provide for 0100 members and our listeners?
Colin, it's a great question. The big takeaways, I think, for our members, supply chain leaders, number one, things you can't control, fundamental labor supply, demographics, population. Just pay attention to see where some of these shifts are going to create opportunities and try to take advantage of those. This is about staying ahead of the labor supply question to look for openings. We know that there's volatility, but that creates some silver linings to the clouds. And the 2 levers you can pull are automation and, in particular, reskilling. Both of those fit together. The importance about people that you cited in our survey research suggests that your strategy for automation and your strategy for reskilling can fit together in such a way that you future-proof your team at the same time that you reimagine the way your physical supply chain actually gets its work done. So the logical and the mechanical combine with the human to maybe get you out of a labor supply crunch before it actually bites. This episode of Radical Reinvention was produced by Brian Egan, Victoria Marin, Mike Silverman, Catherine Parry, Ursulan Khan, Colin Gilbert, Nick Heineman, Duda Rodriguez, Anna Wooding, and me, Kevin O'Mara. Ko Takasugi Chernovan composed our theme music. To find out more about 0100 and check out our content library, go to 0100.com. If you're interested in joining our community of contributors, send us a note at hello@0100.com.